Hello and welcome to the Road Monkey podcast and our 50th show. Thank you for everyone for being on the journey with us so far, where we've shared more than 50 hours of content since the show launched in 2020. Our show is here to share stories that inspire people, give everyone insights into the different paths that there are through life, and not to see adversity as a roadblock, but simply a hurdle that can be overcome. So for our 50th show, I'm so excited to be speaking to Andrew Mullen. He's a Paralympic star with 2 Paralympic medals to his name, contributing to his tally of 21 international medals that he's collected so far on his journey. But today's conversation isn't defined by medals or even by sport. Andy is a hugely inspirational person whose story is captivating from the off. And we're not going to say much more than that, as we really want you to hear it firsthand. So without further ado, a huge welcome to Andrew Mullen for our 50th episode of the Road Monkey podcast, shining a light on Paralympic sport, a conversation with Andrew Mullen. Hello, Andrew, and welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for sharing some time with us. I've given our listeners and viewers a bit of an insight into you and your story, but I'm really excited to kind of delve down into it in a lot more depth today. So just give us a quick introduction as to kind of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Andrew Mullen. I'm a para swimmer based in Glasgow, training with Ian Wright in the City Performance Glasgow Elite Performance Squad. I've been a para swimmer since about 2010, 2011. I think 2011 was my first senior appearance on the GB team. And I've been to pretty much every major since then, bar maybe one where I took like a slight break from swimming. So yeah, been on the senior para swimmer for the past 10 years. Hopefully we'll be competing in my 3rd Paralympic Games this summer. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're obviously excited to see you race this summer, and we'll come on to some of that a bit later on. But I'm curious to go back to the beginning. How did this all start? And you know, most people, I guess, when they're at school, that, you know, what you've probably done over the last decade probably wasn't on your list of to-do. So at what point did you suddenly actually go, oh, this is something that I could do for the rest of my life?
You know, it was kind of somewhat of a pretty standard origin story, I guess. I originally started swimming because my mum wanted all of her children to be safe in the water when we went on holidays, or etc., etc. And I think straight from the start, I kind of fell in love with the water, and I enjoyed being in it. I was kind of being a youngster with like a disability. It was very freeing, and it was the first kind of field that I was really able to compete in a somewhat equal field. So I really loved the kind of competitive nature of it. But I don't really think it was until maybe 2011 or 2012 when I really realized that, you know, like maybe I could be pretty good at this. I kind of had a pretty sharp rise in those years. I went from being kind of like an okay swimmer to, you know, actually challenging to make some teams. So I think it was once I kind of started qualifying for the British programs and some of the larger swim meets that I kind of thought, you know, like maybe this could be for me.
How old were you when you went to your first Paralympics?
I was 15 in London, I think. Yeah, 15.
So just talk us through that, because, you know, I went as a spectator, and it was as an adult who was immersed in the sport, it was something unbelievable to see. So just talk us through that experience, because as a 15-year-old, that must have been just mind-blowing.
Yeah. You know, London's a funny experience. When I look back on it now, my memories of it are pretty blurred. I think in the moment I was so immersed in the actual competition itself, I almost didn't really take much time to reflect on the kind of magnitude of the event as a whole. I was just so obsessed with swimming fast and trying to win medals back when I was 15 years old. But no, definitely the super fond memories of that. I think London was both a kind of pretty pivotal turning point in my career and para swimming as a whole. I think para swimming as a movement has come on leaps and bounds since London. And had London not been such a huge success, maybe I wouldn't be here still, you know. So super thankful to have the opportunity to race at those games, and it was kind of like kind of leapfrog my career and pushed me on.
Well, let's talk about, I guess, what happened next, because, you know, it sounds bizarre being in the sports world like we are. You know, London was 9 years ago now, which just, it doesn't seem real. But, you know, it's, I guess a lot of people see like these perhaps little cherry on top of the cake moments and think, well, that's it. But actually, that is a huge amount of time, both leading up to that, but also since then to where you are now. So just talk us through a little bit, I guess, of some of your highs of that experiences and that journey, but also some of the challenges, because, I think too many people seem to think it's, a straight line from A to B. And, we work in the world of sport and know it's anything but.
Yeah. For the first sort of, I don't know, from 2010, 2011, when I started to really take swimming seriously, up until 2016 in Rio, things were relatively plain sailing for me, which I'm pretty thankful for. Like, my progression was really, really linear. I was looking at charting my times the other day, and I don't think there was a season where I didn't PB, and thankfully I had no injuries. So in terms of performance, things were, as I said, pretty smooth and plain sailing. I think the lows for me wasn't really until post Rio. I think I finished Rio, had a really successful games, kind of smashed all my targets and goals out of the water. I think I had an 80% best time percentage, which is obviously pretty good going. I won my first Paralympic medals. So it's kind of funny that probably the lowest point of my career was directly after one of the biggest highs. And I think that was kind of just down to the way that I was approaching swimming. I think I was very, very results orientated, and I was very, very focused on outcome goals, which in hindsight I know is, well, in my opinion, is now pretty terrible. I think that's what leads to such like a huge low after like a huge games like that. I think for that 4 years leading into Rio, I almost had the approach, right, I'm going to go there. If I win like a silver or gold medal, that'll be kind of my I made it moment. And I don't really think those should exist. Because like once you've achieved this I made it moment at 19 years old, like what else are you going to do? So I think that my low point in sport was definitely driven by my belief system. And I don't really think it was like aligned properly with how it should have been. I think now I've kind of made the switch to being like really values driven. I think just being driven by values is like a way more efficient use of time. And I think kind of if your goal for life is to be like the best version of yourself, which I think is probably what most people's goal is. So like within like the finitude of your life, you want to be the best version of yourself. Like values have to be at the core of that. You have to like root yourself to these values, as opposed to anchoring yourself to kind of like tangible, but I guess somewhat like arbitrary goals. Like, who's to say that like a Paralympic gold medal makes you successful, or swimming X time makes you successful? Like, they're obviously in society, like a Paralympic gold medal or an Olympic gold medal is, of course, like very, very well respected, and there's a lot of prestige attached to it. But like at the end of the day, like if you're a kid and you decide, oh, I want to be a Paralympic champion, like it's somewhat of like an arbitrary goal. So post Rio, I had to kind of do a lot of reflection and sort of scrap this outcome way of thinking and kind of rebuild this framework of values that I wanted to kind of base my life around. So I guess like there was a lot of merit from the low point post Rio as well.
Well, we'll explore, I guess, that values and philosophy stuff in a minute, because I'm really curious to unpick that a little bit. And I think it's really interesting what you've kind of alluded to there, because there's so many athletes that might commit to a goal, whatever it is, and they, train week after week, month after month, year after year. They change their nutrition, they work on their sleeping pattern, they make social sacrifices within their friendship circles, maybe drop other sports, whatever it is. And just because they don't necessarily achieve that singular, like you say, arbitrary outcome, I've looked back through quite a few results, and there's some faults in there, and that doesn't mean that race was a failure just because of all of that work and stuff that went into it didn't lead to what we perceive to be a successful outcome. Actually, you've kind of seen it from both sides now, and I think it's really interesting that you kind of zoned in on that. So I guess going forwards from there, how did you actually find out, or not necessarily find out, but how did you actually get down on paper what your actual values were? What did that process look like to go from that outcome focus to suddenly a process focused mindset?
I took a long time away. I took the longest time I'd ever had away from swimming. I didn't swim. I think after Rio, I didn't swim for properly for like 5 or 6 months probably. And then after that, I also like the past 4 years is the most time I've ever had off of swimming. Even even before COVID happened. So I guess I just took a lot of time away and spent some time reflecting. Kind of dabbled in some other like fields that I was interested in. But yeah, I think it's important to have like good people around to speak to as well. I think one of the things that I identified as being really important is having like so I call it like a really efficient feedback loop. So like have people's opinions who like you really respect, and hopefully ideally they would be like kind of experts in their field, and draw feedback from them and absorb feedback from them, and be really, really selective about like what feedback you absorb. It kind of goes back to that, like that paradox of choice. If you have all this different feedback coming at you from all these different sources, it can kind of be hard to identify which kind of branches are relevant and are going to be like beneficial to you. So I think that was one thing I did. Was I spent a lot of time identifying who I wanted my go-to people to be, and then kind of spoke to them and tried to reflect with them about myself. Like, what areas do you think I need to improve on? What do you think like defines me as a person? So I think it's definitely good to kind of get help with these sort of things, because it's such a massive task to kind of undergo by yourself.
How does, I guess, because we talked already quite a lot about sport, how does all the wider stuff fit into that? Because, you know, unless you've lived this journey, or, you know, you're a coach on deck or whatever it is, and actually see it firsthand, it's quite hard to explain to people from outside, I guess, the sphere of sport. And, you know, family form a huge part of that, friends, teachers, you know, when you're at school and all those other things. So how did that all factor into this, I guess, finding a new version of yourself, if you like, or a new philosophy in how you approach yourself?
Yeah, I guess it was, for me, having friends and family that I could just kind of bounce ideas back and forth with was pretty massive. It also gives you like a different perspective. I think sometimes you can be kind of engrossed in this sport, which is kind of this like individual realm that's kind of like, I guess in a way it's like a microcosm of life, but then in another sense it isn't. It's kind of this really like abstract field where unless you're really, really involved in it, like no one's going to really understand what it's like. So I guess it was just kind of communicating with my friends and family about what I was struggling with, and like getting other people's perspectives from other walks of life. And I think that helped me massively. You know, like speaking to some of my friends who've like never had a background in sport, and just, yeah, getting their opinions really helped.
Yeah, I find it's quite a curious thing, isn't it? Because obviously people put sport in its own box, but actually when you talk to people outside of sport, sometimes you get some really interesting opinions because they're not blinded, if you like, or tunnel visioned by perhaps the world that we find ourselves in. What's, again, kind of a bit off the cuff here, but looking back, what was the best piece of advice you've been given since 2016 when you finished in Rio?
You know, I think I was talking to one of my friends who is not involved in sport at all, like never has been. And I was talking to him about the kind of almost identity crisis I was having. Like my goal was to be a Paralympic champion. And I'd always kind of identified myself as, I want to be a Paralympic champion. And that was always like a big part of my personality. And I was speaking to one of my friends who, as I said, never involved with sport. And he was like, oh, well, I guess there'll always be another chance, won't there? He's like, there'll always be another race. I was like, yeah, I mean, it's like a good point. And he was like, it doesn't really matter if you win it, does it? And I was like, I mean, I guess you're right, not really. So I think that was when I started to kind of realize, like, oh, maybe these like outcome goals aren't the most like efficient use of my time.
I do quite a lot of parent talks, and one of the things that I always say, because they'll always ask, like, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to us as parents? And I say, a young swimmer should be able to touch the wall, and regardless of what comes up on the scoreboard, the response and support they get from their family and friends is unwavering. And I think that's one of the more fascinating parts of being an observer in the world of sport, is you see a lot of athletes touch the wall and they either look at the scoreboard or they look at their parents, and occasionally they look at their coach. but you can tell where some people have got into that trap of who I am as a person is defined by what comes up on the scoreboard. And if it's a bad result or it's not the result we'd hoped for, therefore I mustn't be a good person. And I think it's quite a revelatory experience getting past that point to actually where you don't define your value as a human being against the scoreboard.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree.
So I guess this where are we now? So summer. So the last 18 months for you must have been, you've already said you had a huge chunk of time out post Rio anyway, and then COVID come along. So what tools all the way back to kind of 2010, 2011, 2012 have you used to get you through the last 18 months?
I think my kind of personality type and the way I operate was actually very, very well suited for lockdown. I kind of quite like a lot of time to myself, which I've had plenty of. I've also been super lucky that, to be honest, I've not had that much time out of the pool. I had like sort of 3 months at the start, but then ever since then, I've had pretty much full access to all the training that I needed. So the past like 18 months haven't been for me as like traumatic or as difficult as they could have been for some others, but I think in what should have been a really, really kind of disruptive time, it's probably the best training I've done since Rio. I think just because, as I said, I had the time away to kind of like reflect on what I wanted to do moving forward. And I think when you have something taken away from you for 3 months and you don't really know when you're going to have it back, it kind of really like outlines like, oh, this is quite important for me and I actually really enjoy something and this is what I want to be doing currently. So I think COVID was kind of like a blessing in disguise. Like motivation was definitely at an all-time high once I got back in. And I think, for me, I think it was, as I said, a blessing in disguise.
I think it's it's a discussion I've had with quite a few coaches recently, because off the back of a lot of different countries holding Olympic and Paralympic trials, you've seen some unbelievable performances coming across the boards, and actually people are going, well, how's that possible? They've had disrupted training, they've had this and they've had that. And I think a lot of people overlook the fact that you part of your trait of your personality is that you thrive in those difficult spaces. That's what's got you to where you are, and you savor those huge, like, amazing moments where, like, even you said back in London, where actually like you were so focused on the competitive side of it, and all this has done for most people is get rid of all the noise because there's nothing else really going on, and actually just you're hyper focused on what you're doing. So it must be, as we're kind of coming out of this and the lead up, it might be quite weird to kind of get used to normal life going on around you whilst you're kind of just head down focused on these last few months.
Yeah, I think there'll be, both in the Olympic and Paralympics and probably across all sports, there will be a portion of athletes that have kind of derived a massive edge over the past 18 months. Like, it'll probably be pretty clear as to who's handled themselves well over the past 18 months. Because if people have just kind of like, I acknowledge there's like performance barriers in the way with lockdown and limited training, and then just like immediately overcome that, then like their training is just going to be like probably massively like outperform how other people have been preparing. And I think it'll be interesting to see if there's some real like standout performances. I think it was quite interesting like watching the American Olympic trials like last week. I think they just finished, and the amount of teenagers that just like had unbelievable stand-up performances, and it's probably because they just cracked on with it. Like, it's all they kind of know. So yeah, I think there'll definitely be a kind of section of athletes that like really outperform the rest of the field when it comes to Tokyo.
I think one of the other coaches we've interviewed on this season, a guy called Dave Champion, and he talks extensively about it is what it is, good or bad, just take it for what it is and move on and get on with it. Because ultimately, especially being athletes where you are quite orientated towards a specific competition, whatever it is you're working towards, trials times or making teams, actually anything you're not doing that's helping you towards that is just wasting time or wasting energy. And I think a lot of people, oh, this is outrageous, it's unfair, I can't do this, well, I can't do that, therefore, and actually, like you say, there's that slither of people that have gone, cool, crack on. But you must have had that for quite a few years, because surely at a young age, to get into the performance world that you did very early on, you must have started, I guess, refining those performance behaviors as a young teenager, effectively.
Yeah, I think I probably matured a lot faster than a bunch of my competitors. I think one of my strengths as an athlete, I think from a really young age, was I took pretty much complete ownership over what I was doing and recognized that this is my performance. I have to own it, good or bad. And that was also one of the things that really attracted me to sport. I like the kind of individual nature of it, and being able to just completely own the good performances and then be like, oh yeah, wasn't my best when it went poorly. So yeah, I definitely started kind of developing these performance traits, as you said, from a really young age. I think I was very, very probably overly focused as a teenager. Maybe why I had a little bit of a burnout post Rio. But that's the thing, in performance sport, if you want to do really, really well, you have to become completely engrossed in the sport. And I think that a distinction has to be made by you can be completely engrossed in the sport and also not allow the sport to completely define your character. If that makes sense. Which I think was one mistake I made. I was completely engrossed in the sport, but it also took over all my complete character as well. But hopefully now I've kind of got that balance better, and I can become again completely engrossed in the sport, but also more confident in me as a person.
One of the really good things for sport is obviously it does give you so many traits, skills, and abilities that you take forward into the rest of your life. So, looking back across, say, the last decade, what are kind of maybe the biggest three things that you think that's going to serve me well when eventually, a long time away, I hang up my goggles?
I think I've developed a pretty good work ethic. I like to believe I'm pretty mentally robust. And I like to think I'm pretty consistent as well. I think they're probably my top three traits. I think one thing that's not really talked about in sport enough is transferable skills. So if you excel in sport, the chances are excelling in sport. There'll be a lot of parallels between excelling in sport and then accelerating in other fields. So the way that I like to look at it is, and I've picked sport as my field to kind of express my skill set. I could have picked another field like academia or business or whatever. And then once sport is finished and is no longer in the equation, you still have this refined skill set that's worth a lot. I think that needs to kind of be spoken about a little bit more, because I think a lot of athletes, when they finish sport, they're what am I going to do? Now this 10 years is finished, or however long their career has been, it's well, it's not as if that 10 years just been a waste. You've refined the skill set that so many other people won't have. I'm trying to think of another field in which teenagers are really put under that much pressure, and there's probably not really one. So these teenagers, young people, young adults become so accustomed to dealing with pressure. It's just they're so much better prepared for life after sport as well. This is why a bunch of these finance organizations and big banks love to employ ex-athletes, because they know they've dealt with this pressure and they have this work ethic and this consistency, essentially the skill set that you need to have.
I know there's a number of companies in the city that do direct recruitment straight off, the world-class program, because half of the behaviours that they look for in their employees have been honed for a decade or more for some of the people that they recruit. And I guess, have you thought about that in terms of, we were talking before we started recording around, looking at potentially in the field of finance and stuff like that. But have you ever, as you're going through these kind of, I guess, soul searching periods of time where you actually start looking at the bigger picture, if you thought about what the future holds for you post swimming? Yeah,
I'm obviously 3/4 of away from, or yeah, I think I've got 2 or 3 semesters left of my finance degree, much to my mum's dismay. I've kind of been putting that off for a while. I should probably go and finish that. But I guess long term, I've not really thought about kind of what career paths I want to kind of delve into. Although one thing I am aware of now is that challenge is very important to me, and I have to feel like I'm being challenged for me to feel like something's worthwhile. So I guess if I was to go and work in a field, I would probably have to just do it for a while and see if it was challenging me. You know, I would hate to just be in an office kind of punching numbers and just getting by. I think that's one thing. One thing I love about sport is that it's a consistent challenge. And if you want to survive in it and you want to have any sort of like longevity, then you have to rise to the challenge and you have to develop your character. Like if you just kind of stagnate in sport, like what will happen is that any inefficiencies of character or identity, like they'll be brought to the surface and they'll just eat you alive. And that's why some people like just don't make it, but maybe don't have as long a career as they wish to, because like these things just kind of eat them alive and they've not like risen to the challenge and like really addressed how they need to develop as a person. I think that's why I think the stuff that kind of like Michael Phelps did was so impressive. Not just his medal count, which is of course like astronomically good, but like the longevity he had in his career. Like he did it all and then kept going. It's like the mental like robustness and how like at one of himself he must have been to just like continuously did that. I just think it's like massively impressive.
And I think that's interesting, especially now he's kind of stepped out of the sport and again have more time to reflect. Even he talks about understanding of linking your character to some of those performance outcomes, because you know he's had some massive challenges along the way and does thrive in challenge, but you know some of them have been extremely significant. So do you think in terms of like challenges going forwards, that's something that the actual challenge has allowed you to get to where you are now? And do you think you'd have actually, if it had been plain sailing the whole way through, do you think you'd have actually got to the levels that you ended up and you are now, hopefully going to another games?
No, I definitely don't think so. I think challenge is definitely a stimulus for growth. I think a life without challenge would be pretty hollow, and if you aren't challenged, then there's no real incentive to growth because you can kind of just coast through. So I think that's also a kind of good way to deal with adversity, is to view it as, I mean, it might be kind of cliche, but like, view it as a challenge and an opportunity to grow. But it is really true. Like, you need these challenges to evolve and develop as a person. And like, if you didn't have any, you would just stagnate, and no one really wants that.
I've said that to quite a few athletes, I guess, over the last 18 months, because I think as soon as this all happens, you know, the volume of people, regardless of what performance level they were at, actually just who worked in sport or trained in sport and working towards something, it was kind of like, well, everything's been postponed, but that means you can explore new ways of developing your physicality, your mentality, your nutrition, whatever it is, in a way that you'd have never had time to do before. And I think there's probably a lot of coaches and athletes out there that have actually discovered things about themselves, their training, their whole lifestyle, that they would have never had time to sit and pause, because generally you go to a games, you have a month off, do a bit of holiday, see some family and friends, and then you're back into it. And then it's another 4 years. And there's no time to go, well, everything's stopped for 12 months. So actually for 12 months, let's just play around with this a little bit. And we can't necessarily do everything the way we'd like to have done it, but we might find some new stuff. And I think, yeah, there is that difference between the group of people who were complaining and stressing about it all, and actually the others that just took it for what it was, an opportunity. And I think there'll be some amazing results come this summer. And I think a lot of that does come down to how they dealt with adversity, which is something, like you say, that sport can help with. Yeah,
definitely. I'm like super excited to watch how everyone goes in Tokyo. I think it's going to be some pretty like fast. Some pretty fast. So obviously, massive swimming fan, but yeah, I think there's going to be some probably be great performances across the board and like a bunch of different sports, and like you said, kind of breaking the cycle of just 4 years training, month off. It's like just taking time to be like, maybe this isn't the best way to like go about things, or maybe we can try these other things. And I think beforehand, people weren't really not bold enough, but they're just so used to like these systems, and they work. Like, you know, like they're going to develop, like, obviously I can't speak for other sports, but in some of these like training systems, like they work. They're known to work. But just because they're known to work, it doesn't mean they can't be improved upon. So I think what you said, like, people have definitely become like more creative. I think that'll probably show.
I want to ask, I guess we had quite a philosophical discussion today. I want to cast your mind back now, knowing everything you know now and everything you've experienced both in sport and in wider life. What would you say to the little kid that was going into the pool for the first time, giving them a piece of advice as to what was coming next?
Oh, it's a tough question. I think I would say, I don't know if a kid would really understand it, but just really commit to investing in yourself long term. I think that if you heavily invest in yourself as a person and not just an athlete, sport will become much easier and you're going to have much more longevity. I think also kind of just like identify why you want to do this. You know, if you solve for why, the how is easy. So I think that's what I would say.
Fantastic. Well, that's a really nice way to pull it all together. We're all excited to see you race this summer, and you know, there's going to be people rooting for you from all around the world. But for now, thank you very much for sharing some time with us.
No, thank you for having me, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
Well, what a conversation with Andrew that was. A super humble guy, and we're really happy to share that right now he's actually in Tokyo in the midst of his second Paralympics, and we wish him the best of luck. Quite a few of our shows coming up are speaking to international swimmers and coaches, but our conversations stretch far beyond the water. Next week we speak to Olympic medalist, double world champion, coach, tutor, and most importantly parent, as we are in conversation with Kerry-Ann Payne. Again, thank you to everyone for sharing this 50th episode with us, as it's a pretty cool milestone for us to reach, as we've now got 10,000 listeners across more than 60 countries around the world joining us. Have a great week, and thanks again for joining us for the Road Monkey podcast.